Hi guys, and welcome to part 2 of my best horror franchises ranking. If this is the first of the 2 videos you clicked into, then I'm sorry to say you're in the wrong place. You need to go and seek out part 1. But if you are in the right place, then let's just crack on with it and find out what is my 20th favourite horror franchise. I saw the first of these way back when it first came out on home video to rent. But I didn't watch the 2 sequels until probably like more than 20 years afterwards, when I got the Blu-ray box set that came out fairly recently. And it turns out that I like the sequels as well. I even like the third one, which is a direct-to-video film with none of the original actors. Most people pan it, but there's something about it that I just kind of liked, and I've actually watched it twice now. I think the first of these is the best, and then the second one is just slightly behind the first one, and probably the third one is just slightly behind the second one. The only thing I don't like about I Know What You Did Last Summer is the TV series on Amazon. I just thought that was awful. I tried it for like 2 or 3 episodes, could not get into it at all. I'm not surprised that they cancelled it. If they do bring this franchise back in the future, just give us another movie, please, and maybe bring back Jennifer Love Hewitt whilst you're at it. We need an I Know What You Did Last Summer 2018. That's what we need. Another trilogy, I'd say that number 2 is my favourite of these. So if you don't know, this series is about a cop who goes crazy and starts killing people on the streets of New York. He's got like scars on his face. I could give you more plot than that, but in the interest of being brief, I won't today. There's a bit of an action slant to these films. It's not just horror. You get like car chases and stuntmen doing impressive things, but these films really creeped me out when I first watched them in the 90s as a teenager, and I can still really enjoy them today. They're not cheap to buy. I think the first Maniac Cop cost me about £15 on Blu-ray, and the second one is even more expensive. But if you can get hold of these films, they're really enjoyable. I've always loved the legend of Matt Cordell. This is a series that sort of crept up on me over the years as something that I do really like. For the longest time, I would just kind of occasionally watch a new Purge film on streaming from time to time. And then after a few years of doing this, it suddenly dawned on me, you know what, I've seen like 3 or 4 of these now, and I've enjoyed all of them. I'm going to have to sort of pay attention to the Purge more in terms of new films and stuff. So that's what I did, and that's how I then went to watch the 5th film at the cinema, the Forever Purge, the first time that I'd seen any of these at the cinema. That's how you know that you're starting to really get into a franchise, when you're willing to actually go to the cinema to watch one. And I really enjoyed the 5th one when I saw it, and I think they're going to do a 6th one. I just don't think they've really finalised their plans for that yet, but I do think it's coming. This is another series that I'd definitely like to do reviews for in the future. How can you not love Kate Beckinsale going around killing vampires and werewolves in a moody Gotham-type setting? I do love this series. There is an element of, shall we say, diminishing returns a little bit, because the first film is probably the best, and then I'd say the second film is probably the next best. Although there are no outright terrible films in this series. Even the one that doesn't have Beckinsale in it is pretty damn watchable. It's another series I'd love to review. I just don't have the time to get around to all of them. Another indication that you're a fan of something when you own a bunch of films on DVD, and then you're willing to spend the time and the money to upgrade them to Blu-ray, which is what I did with my Underworld films about a year ago. This is a horror anthology series which has maintained an incredible level of consistency throughout all of its 5 movies so far. There is a spin-off movie to it, which is pretty terrible in my opinion, but all of the mainline films are superb. This is a franchise which has had a little bit of a resurgence in recent years, because originally there was a trio of VHS films, and then they stopped making them for ages, and then Shudder sort of bought up the rights and have started cranking out new ones and having them as exclusive releases for the Shudder platform. They've done 2 in the last 2 years alone, and there's a third one coming out this coming October as well. The newer ones are just as great, if not better, than some of the older ones. This is a franchise that I did reviews for all the films quite recently, actually, maybe less than a year ago even, and I did a ranking for all of them as well. The only thing with these is that you can't buy all of them. I think When it comes to the Shudder ones, because they're exclusive to the platform, there's no physical releases for those. There are for the older ones. I've got the original trilogy on my shelf. At some point, I hope they change that situation and do like a massive box set of this, because it's such a fantastic series. I absolutely love it. I got into Evil Dead quite late in the day, so I'm 42 now, but I don't think I watched a single Evil Dead movie until I was approaching maybe 35. They just didn't used to show these films on TV when I was growing up, so I was never likely to get into them, and I don't remember them even being in the video store, to be honest. On British TV, they would show things like Halloween and Friday the 13th, but they wouldn't show Evil Dead. I guess they thought that that was too violent, you know. But the first film in this series is probably one of my favourite horror films of all time now. I just think it's absolutely amazing. I definitely prefer my Evil Dead to have more horror than comedy. That's why I prefer number one over number two. But there's no bad films in this series. The worst one for me right now is probably Army of Darkness, but I can still enjoy that if I'm in the right mood. I've got a couple of beers, and I just fancy watching that sort of Evil Dead film. The new one that's coming out, Evil Dead Rise. I didn't think that much of the trailer, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the film itself won't be great. An example of a film that had a great trailer but wasn't actually an amazing movie, probably Halloween Kills. But this is a series that thankfully hasn't been overexploited over the course of time. There's still only been 4 films at the time of doing this video. What, 4 films in 40 years? But I think that has benefited the brand, that there aren't loads of bad sequels. Video game came out just last year and apparently is pretty decent, and we're finally getting another movie very soon. So yeah, it's all good with this, and I might be a late to the party Evil Dead fan, but I'm definitely a fan now. So if you don't know, Wrong Turn is about mutated rednecks terrorizing people in the woods of West Virginia. There's no masterpiece movie in this series, but there is consistency. I enjoy all of the films in this series, although not everybody would agree that all of the sequels are really good. It just so happens that I like them, although I've not seen number 5, which is a little bit of an anomaly with me that I've been meaning to rectify for some time, and I just haven't gotten around to it. Off the top of my head, I'd say that number 2 is the best for me, although a lot of people would say number 1, and a lot of people would possibly say number 7, the remake, which came out just a couple of years ago. This is a crazy little series, but there's a lot of variety between the films, which I think is definitely a positive overall. Although I'm definitely someone who likes this series more than most people. I think if 100 people did this same ranking, probably Wrong Turn wouldn't come as high as this that often. So this one's about demons and the supernatural and alternate dimensions and hauntings. There's a lot that goes on in any one Insidious film. It's not an easy franchise for me to give you a very quick synopsis for, although the type of horror here is very similar to what you get in some of the mainline Conjuring films, which makes sense, I guess, given that James Wan pretty much started both franchises. Similar to Wrong Turn, there's a very high level of quality here from film to film. They don't bring out Insidious films that often, sort of every 4 or 5 years maybe, but when they do come out, there's a certain minimum level of quality that you can expect from these films. I don't think I've seen a bad one yet, and I'm sure that when the 5th one comes out in just a couple of months, actually, that will be a film that I really like as well. I've just got an instinct about it. This is probably quite a divisive one that I've got this one so high, because even though most people will agree that the first Paranormal Activity is a very skillfully handled, low budget film that came out at a time when found footage hadn't yet been done to death, when it comes to the sequels, you'll probably either fall into 2 camps. You'll either really enjoy most or all of these films, which would include me, that camp, or you'll just have no need for any of the sequels, really. But I do like the ongoing storyline in this. I like how you're not given all of the pieces of the puzzle. You've kind of got to read between the lines a bit when it comes to the overall mythology. I've still not seen the 7th one, but you know what? In my defense, when you're a fan of so many franchises, they're not easy to always keep up to date with. There is a Blu-ray box set that came out for this quite recently that I've got my eye on. It's like £60, and it does include the 7th film. So I'm kind of waiting until the time is right to buy that. But yeah, I haven't seen the latest one in this series, but overall, I just really like Paranormal Activity. You know, it started out this tiny little acorn of a found footage film on a low budget, and now it's grown into this straight to Paramount oak tree. That made absolutely no sense. Let's move on. So just missing out on the top 10 is another sub-series from within Hammer, this one to do with Frankenstein, although in Hammer's version of Frankenstein, the monster is not Frankenstein, it's the creator. There were 7 films in this series, most of which featured Peter Cushing in the lead role, although there was a kind of George Lazenby type one that they brought out where they shoehorned another younger actor in, but it didn't quite resonate with audiences, that one. I mostly love this series for the Peter Cushing ones, I will admit. They started in 57 with The Curse of Frankenstein, which for me is probably the best horror film of the 1950s. Not that I've seen an awful lot of horror films from the 50s. And these films go all the way up to Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell in like 1974. So you get a massive span of years with these. You get to see Cushing go from a man in his 40s to a man in his 60s, but they're absolutely awesome. This is just absolute vintage Hammer. There's barely a weak film in the whole lot, although some of them are better than others. But let's move on from these and find out what is in my top 10, starting obviously with number 10. I'm just in the process of reviewing these films. I recently got done doing Night of the Living Dead, and I'm about to move on to Dawn of the Dead at the time of doing this video anyway. So I'm not going to say too much about the films in this clip. I'll save it for the reviews, but this is one of the most classic zombie series that has ever been made, if not the most classic zombie series of all time. George Romero directed every single one of the 6 movies in this franchise, and it took him a long time to do so. Like the first one came out in 1968, Night of the Living Dead, and the most recent one, the final one, came out in, I think, 2009. That was Survival of the Dead. So it took Romero over 40 years to get these 6 movies out. I don't think he always found it easy to get funding to make each of these movies. He had to be patient at times. But in the end, I think he pretty much got all of the films out that he wanted to get out, although I read somewhere that there was one script that he couldn't get out before he died, and I heard rumours that some people are going to try to get that script made, although I haven't heard anything about that project in some time. But in terms of this franchise as a whole, I don't think it's exaggerating to say that there are at least 3 films out of these 6 that are considered absolute classics of the zombie genre. Dracula is our final sub-series of Hammer that appears in this ranking today. It just narrowly beats Frankenstein for me. Christopher Lee, of course, played Count Dracula in most of these movies, and he's the perfect fit to play this villain. We also get Peter Cushing as Van Helsing in at least some of the movies. I'm not 100% sure how many movies there are in this series. It just depends whether you count certain films as Dracula films or not. There's 9 or 10, I guess, overall. I've seen 6 of them and I've enjoyed every single one of them. But yeah, I've not even made my way all the way through yet. I'm still getting there, but I've loved every single one I've seen up to this point. They're not going to be for everybody. You know, they are pretty old school horror films now from the 60s that were made in a certain way. They are quite slow moving at times, but the set design, production design in these sorts of films is absolutely incredible. Atmosphere, first rate, and when it comes to all of Hammer, really, it's just a very, very big part of my horror diet in any given year. Time for more sci-fi horror with Predator, although let me quickly say I love Predator 2 more than I do Predator 1, which probably makes me a bit of a weirdo in some people's eyes, probably a lot of people's eyes actually. But believe me when I say I could talk for about half an hour on my love for Predator 2. Rest assured, though, I'm not going to do that today. This series did kind of languish for a while. There were additional sequels, things like Predators and Alien vs. Predator, reasonable films, but nothing on the scale of the early ones. The release of Prey last year, though, was a real breath of fresh air. In fact, the existence of Prey has probably pushed this franchise into my top 10 today, whereas if we didn't have Prey, I'd probably be referring to this series as something that only just makes my top 20 rather than my top 10. But overall, I love this series, and I have done since the early 90s. I even used to have a video game of Predator 2 on the Master System. That's how far back I go with this. In the 60s and 70s, there was a film production company called Amicus. They made maybe 30 films, something like that. 7 of those were horror anthology films, and it was actually through Amicus that I discovered my love of this particular subgenre. I watched Asylum on TV in the 90s, and I absolutely loved it. The first story in particular really creeped me out, that one with the body parts in the parcels. I also watched Dr. Terror's House of Horrors when it came on TV, but it's only been in the last sort of 5 or 10 years that I've gone out and sought out all the ones that I haven't seen on Blu-ray and DVD, actually just to prove how much I love these films. Let me tell you, the most amount of money I've ever spent on one Blu-ray was a film from this series, Asylum. They brought out this limited edition 2 or 3 years ago, and I instantly bought it, even though it cost like £50 or something. I don't normally spend that amount of money on one film, because when you're someone who likes to buy a lot of films, it's not really cost effective to always get the really great editions, if you see what I mean. But every now and again, I will push the boat out for certain films, and that's what I did with Asylum, and also The House That Dripped Blood, funnily enough. As much as I love VHS, for me, Amicus, still the gold standard when it comes to horror anthologies. I didn't pay much attention to The Conjuring when it first came out. In fact, it wasn't until Conjuring 1, 2, and the first Annabelle had all been released, and at that point I thought to myself, okay, what is it about these films that's got everybody so excited? I'm going to have to check them out. And when I did, to my surprise, I really enjoyed them, despite the fact that up until The Conjuring coming along, I didn't really go in for this type of horror. So I broadened my mind a little bit when I checked out The Conjuring, and it was probably through this series that I then went on to discover how good Insidious is. And now I'm at a point where every time they bring out a new Conjuring film or one of the spin-offs, I'm there at the cinema first week. I went to watch The Curse of La Llorona and really enjoyed it. I went to watch Annabelle Comes Home and really enjoyed that one. In fact, I seem to remember I walked through about 45 minutes of torrential rain to watch Annabelle Comes Home at the cinema. I actually got there and my feet were so waterlogged, I took off my wet socks, pulled a clean pair out of my coat pocket and put them on instead, and just hoped that no one was looking at this strange guy getting his smelly feet out in the middle of the cinema. But that's dedication in my view, walking through all that rain. Also went to watch The Conjuring 3 in COVID conditions, I think, with the masks and everything. But yeah, every time they bring out a new one now, I'm there first week, and it will be exactly that same situation when The Nun 2 comes out later this year. I'm really looking forward to that. Totally into this series. I've been a big Friday fan since probably the early 90s, a long, long time. I don't like the later films in this franchise. Jason 10 is a film that just gets worse for me every time I watch it. I've never liked Freddy vs. Jason, and the reboot from 2009, I just thought that one was awful. But just for that original stretch of films from 1 to 9 that went pretty much through most of the 80s and the start of the 90s, that's just an incredible run of slasher films. I'm not sure we'll ever see that consistency from one franchise ever again, and bringing the films out so fast as well. Jason Takes Manhattan is my favourite of the bunch. You can have a go at me in the comments for that if you want, but it's just a personal thing. I absolutely love that movie. One thing that's been keeping me going with Friday the 13th in recent years, in the absence of new films, is, well, firstly, the fan film Never High Cologne. That was absolutely amazing, and it's winter DLC. But one thing that was very clear from Never High Cologne is just the fact that atmosphere and suspense is a must in future Friday the 13th films, not just fancy kills and naked women. There was a really good, solid blueprint, I think, in that fan film that I hope they take note of when it comes to the eventual mainline films that they will surely be bringing out again very, very soon. The other thing that I enjoyed in recent years was the video game from 2017. I mean, technically not an amazing game, but I just enjoyed playing it to sort of speak to other Friday the 13th fans and getting involved in that community and stuff. And I'm a big gamer, and some of my best gaming memories, honestly, from the last 5 or 10 years are just playing that game and meeting other Friday fans. It was really cool. I've been there since the beginning on this one, pretty much. I bought myself a copy of Scream 1 on VHS barely a few months after it had come out in cinemas. And by the time Scream 2 was in cinemas, I was there. You know, I desperately wanted to see the second one once it was in the cinema. And I've followed these films ever since. And I'm constantly amazed by the consistency of these films because they've never rebooted this or felt like they've needed to reinvent it or change track. They had that brilliant film to start off with, and they've just pretty much kept the same story going, the same world, the same sort of group of characters loosely. They constantly come up with great ideas for new motivations for the killers. I remember when I was watching Scream 4 and thinking, wow, what a great way of bringing this series back at this point, because I just think these killers are so believable, actually. And then they repeated the same trick with Scream 5 with the demented stab fans. God knows what they're going to do with the killers in Scream 6. That film is coming out next month at the time of doing this video, and I can't wait to see what the killers are going to be all about in that film. The setting in New York, I'm sure is going to be absolutely amazing. So yeah, I just can't wait. This has been a massive series for me ever since I was basically 5 years old. Terminator 1 was the first horror film I ever saw. I had nightmares at this idea of killer robots just chasing human beings in the dark. It really hit a nerve with me. And to be honest, my love of horror is born from that idea, really. I know the series has drifted away from horror into being more sort of sci-fi action with a lot of the other entries, but I think in the future they're possibly going to have to go back to how the first film was, you know, lower the production costs a little bit, because this model they've tried to utilize in recent years of throwing like 200 million at each of these movies, it's clearly not working. You know, they're going to have to scale it back a bit. Something else that I enjoyed with Terminator in recent years, other than the films, was the video game Terminator Resistance. And to be honest, my favorite memory from that game is not one of the scenes where you are blasting like loads of Terminators, but actually it was a level where you just have to creep through this dark hospital and just avoid the attentions of like 2 or 3 Terminators with their skin off. Really terrifying sequence. So even though horror is not the main part of Terminator, I'd say overall it is more about the sci-fi elements and the action. For me, the horror is still the best part, even after all these sequels that haven't focused on that. Another franchise I've followed for a long, long time. To be honest, the entire top 5 in this ranking are franchises that I've followed pretty much since I was a kid. My love for them has built up over a long, long time. Probably the highest series in this rankings that I've only got into quite recently is probably The Conjuring at number 6. And even that, I've followed it for probably almost 10 years now. But getting back to Aliens, it has those 2 incredible masterpiece movies, Alien and Aliens. I'm a big fan of the Alien 3 Assembly Cut as well. And going further on, I love Prometheus. It's an incredible movie in my opinion. And when it comes to Aliens, it's not just the movies. Alien Isolation as a video game, it's officially my favourite game of all time, and I've been playing games for 30 years. I used to love the Alien 3 game on the Master System as well. And there are other forms of media when it comes to aliens that I'm into. I've got at least 1 Alien comic compendium and 5 Aliens novels. I just love this series and I follow it in all sorts of different ways. And it seems like the future's bright for Aliens as well, because they've got a TV show coming along soon, I think, and a brand new movie. And it did cross my mind to put this at number 1. I did stop to think for a little while, oh, shall I just bump it up ahead of the one that I thought was going to be number 1? But in the end, I put it at number 2, but I'm certainly a massive diehard fan of Aliens. But it's time to now find out which franchise I have even higher than this in my estimations. Perhaps not the most sophisticated franchise to have as my number 1. Halloween is essentially a guy going around on Halloween slicing people up. But as with all of the other franchises in this top 5, it is something that I have followed for a long, long time. I got into the Halloween films in 1993. We're now in 2023, so you're talking 30 years of fandom that I have thoroughly enjoyed, and hopefully I will get to enjoy this series for at least another 30 years, with plenty more films and reboots still to come. There hasn't been a video game for Halloween like there has been for things like Alien and Terminator and Friday the 13th. Maybe that will change in the future, but certainly there's just something about the whole Michael Myers Haddonfield thing that I absolutely adore. I even like a lot of the Halloween films that other people don't, things like the Rob Zombie ones and Halloween 6. It takes a lot for me to not like a Halloween movie, but hey ho, I'm not going to dwell on this series too long, even though it has come at number one, because it does feel at times like I have talked about Halloween to death on this channel. So that brings us to the end then of my top 40 horror franchises ranking. If you've watched both of these videos, thank you very much, and I'll be back very, very soon to do another video. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.